Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly massive turning point in human history. We're going to look at how a purely commercial quest for spices somehow morphed into a ruthless blueprint for a global empire. It's basically the ultimate 15th century geopolitical scramble. Let's just jump right in with a pretty wild question. Who were the very first Europeans to actually claim Indian territory since the days of Alexander the Great? I mean, that is a staggering historical gap, right? And the answer really sets up the monumental scale of the story we're diving into today. It was, of course, the Portuguese. And what's absolutely staggering here is the sheer timeline. The Portuguese arrived in India way back in 1498, which made them the first Europeans to establish a foothold. But incredibly, they were also the absolute last to leave. It wasn't until 1961 that the Indian government finally recaptured Goa, Daman, and Dio. Think about that for a second. That's an empire with its hooks in the subcontinent for over 4.5 centuries. So here's our roadmap for tracking the rise, reign, and ruin of this massive empire. We're going to cover the race for India, from trade to territory, building the state, military innovation, and finally, enter the Dutch. All right, let's get into part one, the race for India, and this incredible quest for the East. It all kind of kicks off with the ultimate geopolitical power move, the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. The rulers of Portugal and Spain basically just drew an imaginary line right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Spain claimed the non-Christian West, and Portugal, they claimed the non-Christian East. With Portugal now pointed directly toward the Indian Ocean, navigator Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1487, essentially proving that, hey, a sea route to India was actually possible. Then, a decade after Diaz, an expedition finally makes the real push. It took them almost 11 grueling months at sea, but in May 1498, Vasco da Gama arrives in Calicut. He was guided by a Gujarati pilot named Abdul Majid. Now, da Gama was actually received pretty peacefully by the local Hindu ruler, the Zamorin, and he stayed there for 3 months. But here's the kicker. When he finally returned to Europe, he sold his cargo for a profit so massive, it literally sparked a global frenzy. Which brings us to part two, from trade to territory, or as we'll see, a very violent pivot. Yeah, so that peaceful, highly profitable reception, it really didn't last. Just 2 years later, in September 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral arrived to set up a factory at Calicut. Well, locals attacked it, killing Portuguese workers, and Cabral's retaliation was absolutely ruthless. We're talking seizing Arab merchant ships, killing hundreds of people, confiscating cargo, and literally bombarding Calicut. And when Vasco da Gama came back later, he brought the exact same hostility. The bridge was completely burned, and the Portuguese just started fortifying centers like Cochin, all under the guise of, protecting trade. To really lock down this new aggressive stance, Portugal's first governor, Francisco de Almeida, introduced what ended up being a masterstroke of geopolitical strategy in 1505. They called it the Blue Water Policy. The goal was simple but massive: become the absolute masters of the Indian Ocean. And he wasn't messing around. After his son died in battle, Almeida went out and crushed the combined Egyptian and Gujarat navies in 1509. By totally destroying the competing Muslim trade, those waters officially belonged to Portugal. Moving on to part three, building the Portuguese state, and how they went about anchoring this ocean empire. So, how exactly do you anchor an ocean empire on dry land? Well, enter Alfonso de Albuquerque. He's really the true architect of Portuguese statehood in the East. In 1510, he captures the port of Goa quite easily, and it prompts this major realization. This was the first Indian territory held by Europeans since Alexander the Great. It wasn't just some trading post anymore, it was sovereign soil. The line from commerce into pure conquest was officially crossed. Now, managing a sprawling chain of fortresses stretching all the way from Africa to China, that requires a pretty strict hierarchy. Just below the viceroy sat the vendedor de fazenda. Think of him as basically the chief operating officer of the entire empire, handling all these massive revenues, cargoes, and the vital fleets. But out on the fringes, they had to rely on local factors, basically local managers. And because communication with headquarters took absolutely forever, these guys often use those massive delays to build up their own personal wealth. Their impact on the ground was profound, and honestly, you can still feel it today. I mean, they built roads and introduced vital new crops like cashew nuts, tobacco, and better varieties of coconuts, things that are just staples of modern life now. Now, while Albuquerque notably abolished the practice of sati in Goa, The Portuguese also brought in some extremely aggressive religious policies. The forced conversions driven by the Jesuits in particular bred this deep political paranoia and just immense resentment among both the local Hindu and Muslim populations. Let's shift gears to part 4, military and maritime innovation. This is the disruptive tech that made it all possible. You might be wondering, how did they even survive against all that local resentment we just talked about? Well, the answer is pure technological disruption. Their multi-decked ships were built to survive these brutal Atlantic gales, which meant they could carry cannons that were far, far heavier than anything local private merchants were sailing with. They used castled prows to repel boarders at sea, and on land, they deployed matchlock men decked out in heavy armor. By the 1630s, they were introducing highly drilled infantry tactics, and that actually became the blueprint for the sepoy armies that were later adopted by the French, the English, and the Marathas. For a long time, it was just an absolute unmatched military edge. But of course, monopolies never last. Let's look at part 5, Enter the Dutch and the ruin of the Portuguese monopoly. Like I said, monopolies never last forever. And while the Portuguese spent decades slowly subjugating territories like Diu and Daman, their actual dismantling, it happened at lightning speed. By the turn of the century, the Dutch had ousted them from Southeast Asia. By 1612, they lost Surat to the English, and then by 1663, the Dutch completely swept up their Malabar coast fortresses. It all fell apart incredibly fast. The Dutch dismantled them with this systematic, almost corporate level of ruthlessness. Starting with their very first factory in Masulipatam in 1605, they went straight for the Portuguese jugular, capturing key bases like Nagapatam. They basically just set up a hyper-efficient network across the Coromandel Coast and Bengal, successfully hijacking those super profitable monopolies in indigo, silk, and saltpeter. But you see, the Dutch were playing a slightly different long game, and it led to a massive geopolitical pivot. After years of really exhausting warfare, the British and the Dutch finally struck a compromise in 1667. The British agreed to back out of Indonesia, and in return, the Dutch essentially retired from India to focus entirely on their hyper-profitable Spice Islands. Ultimately, any lingering Dutch ambitions left over in India were totally crushed by the English at the Battle of Hooghly in 1759. Which leaves us with this final, kind of provocative thought. When an English captain named William Hawkins arrived in Surat in 1608, politely requesting permission to do some business, the heavy lifting was already done. The Portuguese had violently mapped the routes, they built the fortresses, and they proved that a European power could absolutely force an oceanic monopoly. So, as we wrap up this explainer, ask yourself, how much did this initial scramble for spices inevitably write the exact blueprint for the entire British Empire in India? Thanks for joining me today, and keep exploring.